The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Carmina Mora, aka The Artist. I'm happy to be done with the trickster, but now I don't know where to begin with the newest subject.
Okay.
Carmina Mora's existence is just to endure a disproportionate amount of misfortune. I'll be honest, I don't understand this one. Born in Chile sometime in the 1940s or 50s, Carmina's mother abandoned her as a child, and her father resented her for it. In the tome, we learn that the father quarrelled with the mother, and Carmina often felt scared and alone. The tome paints the dad as something of a tyrant, so I'm going to tag him as an abusive father. About a year or so later, Carmina's younger brother Matthias drowned in a creek. It's implied the father blamed Carmina for that as well, even though he was also present. Carmina was devastated and unable to move past her grief, later attempted suicide. But hundreds of crows came to stop her, crows which aren't native to Chile, and we the audience recognise as agents of the entity. They still saved her life, and she was inspired by this experience to paint again, to express her grief and sorrow. In a few years she'd made a name for herself, inspiring other artists. She was active in the theatre and wrote poetry and all sorts, something of a Renaissance woman. But soon she had attracted the attention of the VAC label. It's the Black Veil. It's obviously the Black Veil.
My name is Guy Incognito.
Well, Carmina didn't trust them anyway, and she found out they were connected to multiple disappearances of other artists. So she attacked them with her art, depicting them as monsters against the people. Political discussions were had, and Carmina had made herself a target. She hid at her father's house with some close friends when their home was invaded, and they were all captured. After awaking in the middle of a desert, tied up and terrified, a mysterious man cut off Carmina's hands, and then cut out her tongue. Her friends were tied up nearby and forced to watch as this figure tortured the helpless artist. As she was dying, the crows came back to her once again, and they pecked her attacker to death. But then the crows killed Carmina's friends as well. Why did you do that, crows? That was unnecessary. Carmina was devastated, beyond devastated. Again, maybe her sorrow and madness was the crows' ultimate objective. As I said earlier, crows are on the entity's employment list, but if the Black Veil are as well, why did the crows kill the torturer? Why did you do that, crows? One or the other, not both. This is just odd. And then Carmina Mora was recruited into the fog as a killer? Why save her life back in the day in the first place? What was the point of any of this? This entire story is confusing to me. The artist's tome is unfortunately like Deathslinger's in that it doesn't give us new information, but just reiterates this base lore. I'm not even clear what the final cutscene is supposed to be depicting. The wider impression is that the Black Veil are just messing with her, but it's a very unfocused psychological attack, and presumably no one told the torturer he'd be killed. Carmina Mora was also mentioned in Tome 12, Jonah's Tome. This entry talks about all sorts of conspiracies around Carmina's capture. The mother was said to have been driven away by a powerful force, and it was actually the father who betrayed Carmina, resulting in her capture and torture. Apparently, the artists can see into other worlds, and this is what caught the Black Veil's attention, and it's why her mother fled long before, herself also being a creative type. Some of this was confirmed in the tome. Maybe the cult caused Carmina's artistic visions via psychological trauma. It seems likely only Carmina can even see the crows, but then I don't know. What's less conspiratorial is how much her story aligns with a real event of the 20th century. This was the 1973 military coup in Chile, which overthrew Marxist Salvador Allende and installed fascist Augusto Pinochet, all backed by the CIA and Henry Kissinger. May he rot in hell. I need to give a shout out to Pixel Bush, who made a great video on this subject, complete with an interview from someone who was actually there. The date and location match the artist's lore, but what's more striking is how the injuries Carmina sustains were similar to those of the Chilean cultural ambassador, Victor Jara. Jara was an accomplished artist himself, a theatre director, a poet, and a musician, rather than a painter. He was tortured and killed by Pinochet's thugs because of his political beliefs. They smashed his hands so he couldn't play the guitar anymore. They may or may not have cut out his tongue as well, but we don't know for sure. It's so telling that these people can only display creativity when it's hurting others. Maybe they should have formed a SWIFT. And speaking of survivors everyone hates, Jonah Vasquez, who released alongside the artist, was an agent of the CIA. This is the second time the Central Intelligence Agency has shown up in DBD lore, the first being as the backers of Herman Carter's experiments in Lares. That was fictional, but again it had a real-world basis. Many of us know about MK Ultra, where the CIA experimented on people with torture and drugs, and the Doctor's lore alluded to it. The artist and VAC label are fictional, but the Chilean coup was very real. Despite some names changed, the Black Veil are basically a metaphor for the agency, and it's not even the only time the CIA had a hand in overthrowing democratically elected governments. The 1953 Iranian coup was organised by the CIA and MI6. The CIA's reputation as torturers is extensive. Waterboarding is the most famous example. The CIA has been deeply involved with drug trafficking within Mexico, Nicaragua, their own nation, and others, and they've spied on their own citizens with Project Mockingbird. I've already discussed Operation Paperclip, even though that was very early days, but there were more operations if you fancy a disheartening wiki walk. Operation Condor continued the CIA's alleged terrorist activities in Latin America, including the assassination of Orlando Letelier and the Cubana Flight 455 bomb. The Phoenix program was the Vietnamese counterpart. This is only some of the activity we know about for sure. Then there are atrocities and crimes that may or may not involve the CIA and or the CDC, FBI, MI6, NSA, CENTCOM, and I don't know what else. The Guatemala syphilis experiments and the Tuscany syphilis experiments, the various offshoots of MK Ultra, Project Artichoke, Midnight Climax, etc. I wouldn't be surprised if there really was a site just like Lares that we find out about in a few decades. But, again, this is not my jurisdiction. Although nothing is my jurisdiction, and I never want anyone to lose sight of that. Point is, there is a long and sordid list of reasons to hate this organisation, and an ignorant pleb like me can't do it justice. It's worse than any true crime serial killer. More than any other character, the artist has a clear, real-world equivalent and is blatantly based on this event. There isn't a serial killer or true crime event that could possibly be closer to the Chilean coup. So this puts me out of a job. However, there were a few cases this story reminded me of. Lawrence Singleton raped and mutilated poor Mary Vincent in 1978. He then sliced off both her arms and left her for dead, but she survived and later testified in court. Mary Vincent joins the ranks of people like Alison Botha, who was raped, disemboweled and nearly decapitated, but still survived, and again was vital in the arrest against her attackers. The human body really is tough, and there's the case of Susan Kuhnhausen, who was targeted by an assassin hired by her ex-husband, but she wound up killing her would-be attacker instead. There are some amazing stories of tough women who survived against all odds, but we're moving further and further away from the story of Carmina Mora, and I must keep focus. I still want to give a shout out to Lisa McVeigh though. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, Carmina is the first character in Dead by Daylight that has a coherent political position. She's a socialist, she's an allegory, or parable if you like, I don't know, for Victor Jara, and a paper-thin one at that. I have a feeling that the artist and the trapper, blatantly a conservative, have argued extensively over the killer campfire. I think other killers have right-leaning tendencies as well, but I'm not going to touch that. Point is, this is a killer that really doesn't fit in with the established roster. At least Rin and Lisa seem to have some moral failing in their character that made them strike a Faustian deal with the entity. At least Adiris had a direct line to this evil god, and wound up killing her father figure, misguided but still a servant. Even the twins had echoes of darkness about them. I mean, they killed a lot of people. Most of those people deserved to die, what with being French, but the twins are still killers. Carmina is the second killer who's never actually killed anyone. The entity's recruitment practices will confuse lore buffs for a long time yet. On top of a confused story, her gameplay character is some kind of bird lady. She's very bird-like, and she shoots crows at survivors and has these ink hands. Anyway, after Nemesis came out and completely eclipsed the Trickster, I stopped playing. This was before DBD released Cenobite. I was never that big on Hellraiser anyway, and the kerfuffle around Boone's Circle of Healing marks this as a turbulent time. Portrait of a Murder and everything surrounding it seemed very weird, and it didn't bring me back to the fog. In hindsight, that's a massive shame, because I love this killer. She can pressure survivors at a distance and juggle the entire match, making her presence be felt. This is supposed to be a 1v4 after all. When playing as her, I try to outsmart my chased target, predict their movements and use my ability intelligently, limiting their options. When going against her, I feel oppressed, as I should be. I try to outsmart her, and I actually fail more often than not. The artist is often third or fourth in tier lists, and I agree. If you go against an artist that knows what they're doing, it's going to be rough. She's kind of the opposite of Trickster. I love her gameplay, but dislike her lore. I feel like I missed out with the Portrait of a Murder chapter despite its reputation. However, I would come back to DBD a few months later in early 2022, ending my second huge holiday. And yes, it was for Sadako, also one of my favourite killers. DBD is always a mixed bag, and reliably unreliable.
Come on! Turn to the light! God, come on, you can do better than this! You are better than this! Didn't your parents ever tell you that?